No. Technically, Jon Jones is not ducking Tom Aspinall because in order for that to be true, the UFC would have to be offering him a fight with Tom Aspinall, which we know they're not actually doing. But that's the entire problem. Jon Jones should be fighting Tom Aspinall. It looks like he's not going to be, despite the fact that Tom Aspinall is wearing an interim belt and he, Jon, is the current heavyweight champion. And from what I can tell, at least online, the only people who want that are Jon, Stipe, and the UFC. I don't even know in 2024 who the audience is even really for Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. Let's talk about what's actually happening here. This week, Stipe Miocic said not only does he want no other fight but Jon Jones, which you can more or less understand from his perspective, but neither here nor there. What he really said was that fight's unlikely to happen until November when the UFC returns to Madison Square Garden in New York City, right? Now that's interesting because remember, Jon Jones returned to fight Cyril Gane at UFC 285, which was in March of 2023. Then he was supposed to fight Stipe Miocic at UFC 295, which was in November of 2023. Now it looks like he's not going to fight Stipe Miocic until November of 2024. That's the first part of the news that came out. And of course, Jon Jones last week was tweeting all about fighting Alex Poatan Pereira and all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of all related, but he really doubled down on why he was going to take the Stipe fight next and really nothing else. And it will not surprise you that very little of anything he said made sense, but the combined two things that had happened blew up on the internet yesterday. But there are two essential details that I want to talk about that I think make the most sense. Let me read them to you and then let's talk about them because it actually helps us understand how did we get here? Who is responsible for why we seem to be stuck in a situation as fans where we're being forced to accept a fight that makes no sense at the expense of the growth of the division and potentially the next big thing in this division? So here's what he said. First of two things, let's talk about it. Quote, I'm in the middle of a pretty clear decision. Stick to exact and original plans and fight the man with all the accolades, or completely disregard all of the Stipe training I've put in and fight another potential hype train that may not even be around in 3 years. I am not changing my plans for anyone. Stipe is over there as the best heavyweight ever working his ass off. I'm going to give that man what he wants and I'm going to claim another head. Whatever comes next, comes next. Okay, so there's just a ton of problems with this. The first thing is he doesn't want to switch up his training. And yes, a world-class athlete with high stakes. He isn't currently the champion. No matter what you think of Stipe, if he loses the belt, that would be very ruinous for him. Doesn't want to change up his training that has been very specific to Stipe. First thing I'd say is Tom Aspinall has something of a similar athletic profile, right? Well-rounded, can wrestle a little bit, obviously, can strike a little bit, fast. Stipe is not fast anymore, but at his prime, you know, there are meaningful differences, but they're not like radically different fighters in that sense. I understand that there are differences and you wouldn't want to switch them up, but that by itself wouldn't be a reason not to necessarily do it. First thing I want to say about that, and I think also the thing I'd say is if you're not going to fight till the summer, you actually have plenty of time to make a specific game plan around Tom Aspinall. I know that Tom is actually fighting in the UK for the upcoming Manchester pay-per-view. I'm just pointing out, yes, that could be something of a limiting factor, but it's really not that big of a limiting factor. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is this idea that 42-year-old Stipe, which is what he'll be if they fight in November of 2024, is the guy with all the accolades. Yes, if you catch a guy at the very, very end of his career, you're going to beat a guy who did all of those things at a previous stage and a lifespan, so to speak, of his career, but that's really not the stage Stipe is at all. He hasn't won since August of 2020, and he hasn't fought since March of 2021 when he was viciously knocked out by Francis Ngannou. I'm not here to demean the career of Stipe. It is absolutely exemplary, but the guy you're getting at the end of this run, 42 years of age, hasn't fought in nearly 4 years, hasn't won in nearly 5 years by the time that fight happens. That's not the same guy. Yeah, you're beating him, but you're not beating that guy. You're beating, I'm not going to compare Stipe to Muhammad Ali, but I'm sort of pointing out any guy who's at the very end of their run was a facsimile, in some cases a cheap facsimile of who they were when they actually got all of those accolades. So like, you know, Jon, for example, told TMZ before the Gane fight, this was in February of 2023, that he was chasing legacy. And maybe that argument held a little bit more sway before he had returned against Gane and certainly before UFC 295, but it carries significantly less value right now. Then there's something else Jon says. Quote, Would you agree that it's just as selfish to have a completely healthy intern, he means interim champion, who is only 30 years old, sitting out and waiting to fight the winner of a 42 and 36-year-old? Should be a question mark there. Who literally actually already committed to fighting each other, question mark. No one stopping anyone. I'm on a mission. No, I would not consider that selfish. First of all, because he can't get this unification fight from Jon Jones, he is forced to have to defend his interim title, which he'll do, again, at this upcoming July Manchester event, UFC 304. He literally is having to defend an interim title because he can't get the unification that is supposed to come next. So no, I wouldn't actually say that that's in any way selfish. In fact, what I would say is it's selfish to put a guy like this in this position to begin with. Second of all, it's just inherently contradictory, at a bare minimum weird, to say, well, this fight that I'm taking with Stipe, because I can't take any other one, is for legacy. And then when you're trying to accuse the interim champion who is waiting on you for being selfish for waiting on you, even though that's what he's supposed to be doing, because you're actually saying, well, he's 30 and he's waiting on a 42 and a 36-year-old, isn't that kind of weird? Guys, why? What? How is the audience supposed to accept that this fight between Jon and Stipe, which has to happen because it's for legacy and it's the best ever versus the best ever, and yet Jon, in order to escape the responsibility of defending his title through unification, is arguing, well, it's just between some 42-year-old and a 36-year-old, a couple of has-beens. Well, which is it? Is it a fight between two geriatric fighters that Aspinall is wrong to wait for, or is it a fight between two greats that Aspinall has been sidelined for? It can't be both. It can't be both. Now, Jon goes on to say a lot of other things that are not necessarily all that interesting. He took a shot at the UK audience, if that's something you want to see. He was reminding everyone that he's really great at playing the dozens in press conferences. You can go look at all the tweets for yourself and see what you think of them. But that's basically the important part about what he said. And I really want to talk about this because, in addition to the points I've just made, it kind of brings us back to, like, how did we get here? I don't just mean because of the injury that Jon suffered, the pec tear that prevented them from fighting at UFC 295, but I mean, like, what are the mechanisms in play? Because I've seen people say, oh, this is 100% Jon's fault and no one else's. And that's not quite true. There's actually a bit of a blame to go around here. Yes, he is part of it, but there's more. If you have a belt in combat sports, it not only confers status, right? You're the guy or the lady or whatever the case may be, and certainly that is, of course, a regal position, but it also means if you're going to do that, the way the belt system functions, both in MMA and boxing and certainly other sports that use this system, is it not only signifies who is the best at that time, but it helps create a contendership queue that champion has a responsibility to defend against. Otherwise, it creates stagnation. We're already at the point where we have an interim title. We're at the point where we have an interim title, and that interim title has to be defended because the champion, who was legitimately injured, but also is just seeking fights that otherwise do not make sense for a guy who, basically, by the way, Stipe is ranked 5. I don't even know if he should be in the contendership queue. It creates problems when you have a belt in place and then you don't follow the architecture and the system in place that makes the belt work. A belt system doesn't work if you just award a belt and then they never really have to defend it, or they can defend it randomly against whoever. And yes, of course, we understand there are times when the matchmaker will have to do things that are creative in terms of awarding title shots, so they won't necessarily always give it to the number one contender. But here is a case where we actually have an interim title already there and now set to be defended because the interim unification with the heavyweight champion won't happen. It's not a mystery about who the number one contender is. There is no debate about that. It's not mysterious. One person has a title, another person has a title. The only fight to make is the resolution of that, so we don't have to have two titles floating around the weight class at all times. And I talked about this on Morning Combat. It is so bizarre to me that, and I always say there are many MMA fans who have grown wary of the situation, but it is very, very strange to watch folks, whoever they may be, fans or otherwise, media members too, argue that MMA is superior to boxing because we don't have a bunch of weight classes, we don't have a bunch of champions not defending titles, we don't have just a bunch of this bureaucratic nonsense that no one ever is supposed to fight the guy they're supposed to fight because we just make the best fight the best. And then here the situation comes along, and then you'll hear various folks argue, oh no, Jon's earned the right to fight whoever he wants. Yes, of course he has. I don't begrudge in any way Jon's desire to fight Stipe. At 36 years of age, with limited time left in the sport, I don't think that that's an irrational call or altogether a terrible fight, but it doesn't make sense in the context of the belt system. As long as you have decided to wear the belt, whoever you may be, John, whoever else, in any weight class, any sport where the belt system is used, to the extent that a person wears that, they have a responsibility to the division. Otherwise, it ends up really messing up things within that division. That architecture has to have a certain flow in order for it to all work. When you start introducing things like this, these detours, everything gets messed up. A belt is status. Yes, a belt is also responsibility. I mean, here's the reality. The UFC bears some responsibility for this too. Now, folks can say, well, they shouldn't have introduced the interim title. I really disagree with that. If you have a champion out that long, introducing interim title actually gives you a bit of breathing room, but of course you have to unify thereafter, and they're not doing that right away, and that creates even more problems. But I don't really think the interim title is the issue. I think the monetary way in which the sport works is the issue. Two basic problems here. Now, Jon already has the belt, and what we have said is if you want to go take him or anyone else, anybody who wants to take at the end of their career a bit of an easier fight against someone with a bigger name, there's really no problem with that. It's just a problem when the belt is held hostage as a consequence. But dropping the belt and going fight the guy, who could be against that? Well, probably Jon and any other champion would be against it, right? Because if you don't have the belt, in all likelihood, you lose pay-per-view points. That's where all of the money is made. So Jones has a significant incentive to hold on to the belt, not because it's or any other reason he has stated on Twitter. It's probably because there would be a significant downgrade in whatever financial return he would get without it. That's a huge, huge component. Stipe probably has a similar calculation about wanting to get the belt back, maybe, but I doubt it. I think his is probably more for genuine legacy, right? If Stipe were to beat Jon Jones, that would be a huge feather in his cap. Maybe there would be a rematch. I don't know. But in that particular case, attaching the real amount of monetary gain to the belt owning status, it changes significant calculation. I know what you might say. Well, he's still going to have the belt when he fights Tom Aspinall. That's true. I understand that. But I can see why he wouldn't want to let it go in order to fight Stipe, because he's going to lose a ton of money. That doesn't absolve him of responsibility. If you've got a belt, you have to defend it, especially when there's another guy holding the belt in that division. But the way in which the UFC has constructed this business, it alters the incentive structure a lot. And then the other part is, if you want to get Jon Jones back to fight Stipe and there's no belt on the line, the UFC basically has kind of decided they don't want to do pay-per-views that way. They want to have some belt on there. It's part of the reason probably why BMF was introduced. Again, I think Max has, through his exploits, conferred status back onto the BMF belt. But it's easy to say, oh, Jon should just drop it and there he could go fight on this pay-per-view. And then the reality is, as we know, one, their financial return for not getting pay-per-view points would be less. And then on top of that, the UFC would be kind of in a place where they would want to, or they would be forced to rather, have a non-title pay-per-view, which they've done. It's not the end of the world, but it would, in their mind, be a suboptimal way of doing business. So there really isn't just only Jones as a culprit here for why this fight isn't being made. The business structure is changing all of this. And then you have to add in the fact that the UFC is not necessarily offering this fight to Johnny. Anything that you hear Dana White say in the media when he's asked about the necessity of this fight is this fight has to be made. It's a legacy fight. Like, they want this fight too. They probably are making this calculation. It might be the case that Aspinall could beat Jon, but we don't really know. Like, when Jon says maybe Tom won't be here in 3 years, you can't say he's necessarily wrong. I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, the guy is... okay, he had the 15-second injury against Curtis Blades, but for all intents and purposes, in the same way kind of Jon is, his was through a foul, but same kind of idea. No one's really beaten Tom Aspinall in his UFC run. Neither has similar thing happened to Jon Jones. And so the point I'm trying to make here is he's undefeated in the UFC, and all of his wins come by way of stoppage. I don't think it's fair to say he'll be gone in 3 years, but I have seen people through the course of Jon's career say, oh, this guy's going to stop him, this guy's going to stop him, this guy's going to stop him, and then he goes through all of them. I understand why he might be a little bit cynical about that, but this is different because, again, he's wearing the belt, which the UFC put on him, which they needed to put on him in order to make sense for this division. To have no title floating around and not being defended is going to create even more problems. So I'm halfway sympathetic to Jon on that idea. And the last part here, if I may say so myself, is remember how we started. I said Jon's not ducking because no one's actually offering him fights with Tom Aspinall. right? The UFC could be doing that. They're not. So how is he supposed to turn down a fight he never got offered? I mean, the UFC is probably making a calculation here. They probably think that Jon has maybe one fight left, two at most, but probably just one, probably just this one, and then he's going to call it a day. And so they want to get the most amount of money that they possibly can. And him giving up the title and fighting Stipe doesn't necessarily get them there. Heavyweight fighter with the champion versus former heavyweight champion altogether. That I think they feel is going to be the biggest return on that. And I think right now that probably is still true, although I think how big that fight is in 2024 in November is certainly in doubt, or at a bare minimum very, very questionable. And the other part is this. I don't know what's going to happen between now and March 2024 to degrade the viability of a Jones versus Stipe fight in terms of being a big box office or pay-per-view attraction. But the thing you have to consider is, maybe Jon is right. I've seen people say this guy's going to stop Jon and this guy's going to stop Jon, and then none of them do. And so when Jon is a little bit dismissive that Tom is the next big thing without being truly proven, that's not necessarily altogether unfair. And if he loses, yes, a lot of this blows up, although I still would want to see him unify the championship with whoever the interim champion is. But the point is, okay, but let's talk about it the other way. What if between now and November of 2024, Aspinall wins one more, potentially two more fights, and really does begin to blow up? And now that calculation between who is the bigger star really begins to change to the point where you can make a much stronger argument that the box office return is actually in Aspinall's favor. Now, that would still require him to do something magical and big. And yes, he is going to have this fight in Manchester, or maybe he blows up in the UK market, but that's not a big pay-per-view market. It's still the United States is the big pay-per-view market, or at a bare minimum North America. And so there is still some work to do. But let's say Stipe gets injured before November of 2024. Now you can't do it even on that delayed timeline. And you're coming off a situation where Aspinall just shines against whoever, potentially a Curtis Blades rematch over there in July. It's going to make the equation much different and much more difficult to make. And if we get to a point where not only is Aspinall the interim champion still by November of 2024, but he's actually potentially the biggest box office draw, is the UFC really going to be in a position where they stick to this fight no matter what? God, I hope not. Ultimately, we just know this is not the fight to be made. It's a fight to be made to draw out the most from the box office for an older generation of fight fans that might still be willing to pay for something that newer fans would have less interest in. I mean, that's really the calculation that's being made here. If they really, really, truly believe that Aspinall is right now a bigger box office draw, they would probably make that fight. And they're also probably banking on the fact that if Aspinall wins in July, maybe that will make him a bigger star than Stipe by November of 2024, maybe not, but that his long-term appeal will be fine. And what I would argue is, we don't really know. There's a couple of variables about how this could all go, but if Aspinall wins in July, wins spectacularly, let's say, doesn't get a fight against the winner of Jones and Stipe, assuming that it's Jones coming out of November 2024, it's not to say that Jones couldn't, it's not to say that I should say that Aspinall couldn't be a big star, but it is to say however big he could be will be diminished. Robert Whittaker never got the handoff from George St. Pierre. The biggest way that someone becomes a star is to beat the existing person that everyone regards as the guy. And yes, Jon Jones still is the guy at heavyweight, at least given what he had done to Cyril Gane at UFC 285. If Tom were to beat that guy, and I mean straight up beat him, that would send Aspinall into overdrive. And so I understand why Jon doesn't necessarily, or is not, I should say, is not necessarily enthusiastic about fighting Aspinall. But the UFC is making a very short-term calculation here about who's going to be bigger and what the box office will return in November of 2024 at the potential long-term expense of a guy that looks like he could be the next big thing in this weight class. And that isn't necessarily the wrong bet, but it is not at all clear that that's the right bet. Plenty of blame to go around for a fight that I don't know if anyone really wants to see among the current generation. And by the time we get to November of 2024, it will be very interesting to see if anybody other than Dana White, Jon Jones, and Stipe Miocic actually want to see that fight.